Hi there, I really love Ratchet & Clank and PlayStation. Okay, so you're probably looking at this title, or not, and thinking Red is in her Sonic phase. While that's always true, I feel like the Ratchet & Clank series actually does have different eras. Even though technically there's not really any official statement on this, besides maybe the Future Saga, but I've always kind of split the entire series into four different sections. The PS2 era, the Future era, the Experimental era, and the Modern era. I wanted to mainly discuss what I consider the experimental time period for Ratchet & Clank, because it was a really strange and sort of awkward time period as a fan of the series, at least for the games. So what makes this time period of Ratchet & Clank so odd to me is because it was obvious Insomniac wanted to deviate from the gameplay formula we had gotten for the past 8 years or so. This has always been a common strategy for any long-running video game series to at least attempt a couple of games that are outside of its wheelhouse, which leads us to Ratchet & Clank All for One, a game that to this day gets quite a bit of heat because it's not a normal Ratchet & Clank game. Looking into the behind the scenes and even back then, many people working at Insomniac explained why this game was made. Co-op Ratchet & Clank was a passion project for Insomniac, and there's even some articles and even these background video diaries for All for One that explains that that was an idea that they wanted to try and do. This isn't too shocking when you consider how the series had already played with the idea of multiplayer mode in Up Your Arsenal and Deadlocked. Whether that was through online or couch co-op, it was a relatively active multiplayer, especially on the PlayStation 3 or the HD version, since the internet was free on that system. But it made sense to eventually make a Ratchet game with that appeal. However, the bigger issue that seemed to be more fixated on within the fan base when All for One was revealed were the redesigns for our main characters. This was a huge deal, and it's kind of had a ripple effect to this day regarding both Ratchet & Clank's designs in every game that has been made after this one. There was a lot of outrage, and while it's sort of easy to see it now and be like, why are all these fans complaining? It makes way more sense with context. A Crack in Time is, to this day, considered one of, if not the best Ratchet & Clank game in the fan base. It's our holy grail entry like so many other fan bases have. It's our Sonic Adventure 2 or Uncharted 2, and the fact that there were interviews and rumors that this could possibly be the last Ratchet & Clank game really added to that, I think. Now, imagine going from this to All for One. Yeah, it's a bit different. We had seen a bit of a shift in tone between the entries before, namely Ratchet deadlocked to Tools of Destruction, but at least to me, that shift wasn't that crazy. It felt like a more natural evolution for the series to become more cinematic and story focused, since that's kind of always been a goal from even the very first Ratchet & Clank game. But the shift between A Crack in Time to All for One was just like way more drastic. The reason for the controversial design change was actually so players could distinguish their character better on screen.
You realize that sometimes some tweaks need to be made. So Cork got a little bit bigger, Clank got actually a little bit bigger as well, and then Ratchet just got a little bit more exaggerated with some of his proportions, just to make sure that he could read against this kind of broad canvas of not only other characters, but these environments as well.
And Nefarious stayed virtually the same. We got him a little narrower, his head got a little bit bigger, and that was just to sort of push the emphasis that he was a little bit scarier and he had a little bit more of a bigger cranium.
The A Crack in Time models, while amazing, didn't fit very well onto the screen with 4 playable characters, like, at the same time, right? Like, with all the destruction and weapons and crazy stuff that happens. Besides the character designs, though, the game just feels, unfortunately, a bit lackluster when playing by yourself. The gameplay is similar to the rest of the series, where you collect a ton of weapons and gadgets, you shoot enemies, you level up, you get more XP, and you can explore. But I mean, it feels held back because it's intentionally designed to have multiple people playing at the same time. So to be fair, when playing this game with 3 other people, it is a magical experience. That there is a really great feeling in that. And I've only done that a couple of times, I've only experienced that a couple of times, but it's genuinely super fun. Even with 2 or 1 other person, it greatly increases the experience of playing this game. However, when it's just yourself, the levels just feel very empty. Enemies can become extra annoying, the companion AI sucks, and it was definitely jarring at the time where we all kind of were used to just the classic Ratchet controls, because every game before this was, had the same gameplay style. All for One was the beginning of the brief period of time experimenting on the series, and while it has its issues, I think it's kind of neat that we got a game that genuinely tried being different. It helps that despite the flaws, there are some really great character interactions between the main 4 characters, and I absolutely adore the environments in this game. Only a year later, it was Ratchet & Clank's 10th anniversary, so we got an announcement. Another brand new Ratchet & Clank game! Oh man, I wonder what they're gonna do for such a huge occasion.
Explore the battlefield!
Yeah, this game, being the big 10th anniversary Ratchet game, has always felt like a bit of a sham to me. Full Frontal Assault, much like its older brother, was another game in the series that deviated away from the classic Ratchet & Clank character designs, but also made the bold choice to deviate from the series' story and writing. Listen, I have a huge grudge against this game because I genuinely convinced myself we were gonna see Angela Cross again, and I don't think I can think of a worse thing, honestly. The funny part is this game isn't even bad. I feel like it clearly accomplishes in what it's setting out to do, which is to just be a fun tower defense game, but throw Ratchet & Clank into the mix, they are, wow. Cool. It just felt odd though, because it had a lot of potential, much like All for One, but because these games were being pumped out at such a rapid pace during this time period, it really shows how it hurt this game in particular. That and the fact that they had to make a PS Vita version of the game, which was a very common thing for 2012 PlayStation. Anyways, Full Frontal Assault retains classic gameplay, but nearly everything else just felt lacking, at least when comparing it to the rest of the series. This game, to me, has been the closest to an actual experiment for the series, like an actual experiment, because unlike, say, Deadlocked or the PSP games or All for One, this game introduces interesting ideas, but at the end of the day, it suffers from being a game that was just not made for the right audience. It's a good game, but not a good Ratchet & Clank game. It just screams that Insomniac barely had any time to make this, and then they just sort of released it, which really sucks. Like, I don't like having to say that, but it feels that way. Making the decision to have Stuart Zergo, a different minor character from Going Commando, return as a main villain was such an odd choice, especially since there was a possibility that players might not have even crossed Zergo's path in Going Commando, as it's not a necessity. I really dislike how this character can be summed up as just being incredibly annoying. Like, there's stuff that they could have done to make him interesting, but they just didn't. It just didn't happen. I think it says something that this is one of the few games in the series that I actively decided to skip and played a couple years later. I've only ever done that for 2 other games, Ratchet Deadlock and Secret Agent Clank. This is also the most poorly aged Ratchet game, in my opinion. Going quickly back to the gameplay again, but this is the first game in the series with a really lackluster arsenal set, because it all just felt like reused assets from previous games in the series. At the very least, all of the games beforehand had 4 or more unique and new weapons that were really sick. A plus, though, is that this is definitely the classic Ratchet gameplay we know, but now there's not really much of like exploration that can be done since you have to defend your base. There's also only a couple of levels, which would be fine, but I specifically hate the last level of this game. It just sucks. I don't know. I don't like it. Sorry, guys. I will say, though, once again, if you have a friend or family member who is willing to play co-op with you, it'll make this game's experience go up tenfold, much like All for One. I think despite all of the issues, there is quite a bit of potential for essentially a new type of multiplayer game. This was the last Ratchet & Clank game to even attempt an online multiplayer, and when it was active, it was really fun. I don't think this series would ever stray too far into multiplayer, or it shouldn't, at least it shouldn't stray too far into multiplayer. But hey, if you're making an experimental game like this, I'd gladly try it. I mean, this is the game that gave me my stupid avatar, so that's gotta be something, at the very least. Full Frontal Assault added to the confusing direction, which is why it's often looked at with a feeling of bitterness sometimes from fans, I feel. But again, it's a good game, just not a good Ratchet & Clank game. Now, within this time period of having 2 games in a row essentially try and be something different from the classic Ratchet & Clank style, Insomniac heard the complaints, which is where we get what I like to call the loophole entry, Ratchet & Clank into the Nexus. Nexus does not feel like an experimental type of game. It feels like an added conclusion to the Future Saga games. This was most evident in the trailer literally using clips from A Crack in Time, and the end credits using screenshots from Tools of Destruction. Add on to the fact that it makes direct parallels and references to all of the PS2 and PS3 games that came before it. It feels like a really genuine continuation. They even brought back Gold Weapons, which the only other game in the series that's done that, at least at this time period, was the original Ratchet & Clank.
Hi guys, I'm Once Gamer, and today we're gonna do all gold weapons in Ratchet & Clank into the Nexus. Doing it on this guy. Okay, so like, shoot him, and he turns from one, it's like, it fades away after a while, but he turns yellow. That's quite cool. Right.
Here's your payment. Pleasure doing business with you.
Okay.
I won't get too into this because honestly, Nexus could have just a whole video in itself, but to me, it's the outlier in this time period of Ratchet & Clank. It's just like a really awesome bite-sized version of the best Ratchet & Clank games, and I'm gonna move on now. I don't know why. Yeah. Finally, I would consider the 2016 Ratchet & Clank game, as well as the movie, the end of the experimental era for Ratchet & Clank. Mainly because, despite the game itself being a classic Ratchet game gameplay-wise, it felt more like an experiment in seeing if the series can still be relevant. I know, it kind of sounds weird, but it's true, The most successful Ratchet & Clank game before this one was Size Matters on the PSP. And then preceded by that was the original 2002 game. The series was declining in sales, partially because a lot of people jumped ship to Xbox during the PS3 era, but also that these type of games just weren't popular anymore. Most kids would rather get, Halo, Call of Duty. I mean, even Uncharted or Infamous were probably more preferable.
The explosion changed my life and ruined everyone else's. Empire City is overrun with criminals and lunatics, cut off from the world by a government quarantine. Everyone thinks I have the power to fix it, but I don't know if I can, or if I even want to.
Rated T for teen.
PlayStation
And then what felt like the final nail in the coffin into the Nexus releasing the same week as the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One's launch, causing to this day to be the least sold Ratchet game. This wasn't surprising. I mean, they launched this game right next to two of the most insanely hyped video game consoles ever. It was always destined to get overshadowed. And then something weird happened. The 2016 game released. As much as I'm not a fan of this game, it sold like hotcakes. Millions of people who either missed out on the series during a certain console or never played the series ate this game up. I could go into how disappointing it was seeing the same arsenal again, or how badly written Ratchet & Clank were in both the game and the movie, or maybe I could talk about how the game literally has less content than the original game, or that the movie bombed. Yet another experiment of trying to see what direction the series should go into and failing. But Ratchet PS4, for all of the reasons I really, really dislike it, confirms something for Insomniac and PlayStation. That there's still very clearly an audience for these games and that we need to get back on track. This game caused so many newcomers to get into this series, encouraging people to look into and play all of the previous games that were made. This game is now the most successful sold Ratchet & Clank game ever, which is insane considering how the game before was literally the least sold. Even with all of the flaws, it's still Ratchet & Clank. It's fun, but just not quite as fun as any of the other games in the series. But it actually allowed people to get to know these characters again, even if it was a not so great version. To show that people still cared about this weird fuzzy alien guy in his robot backpack. Which leads us to now, present day in 2024, where we somehow got a sequel to one of the least sold Ratchet & Clank games. Yet Rift Apart was really successful and has taken a much better turn back to what the series' roots are. I mean, we even got a PC release for the first time in the series this past year. I have my issues with this experimental era of Ratchet & Clank. I think it was very indicative of the time period of how Ratchet & Clank kind of concluded, and because of that, Insomniac wanted to try some different things with the series, obviously resulting in very different levels of success, but it was really interesting, especially as a fan at the time, seeing what worked and what didn't, and what fans wanted and what most audiences wanted and what fans didn't want, and it was really weird, but I wouldn't have had it any other way. The weirdest Ratchet & Clank era is something that I can look back at with some fondness for attempting some risks with the series, even if it didn't exactly work. Hopefully this video helped shed a light on, at the very least, my own experience and perspective of Ratchet & Clank in that time period. Hey, thanks if you survived this long with me talking about this. I've been meaning to do more videos and stuff like this for a while, so yeah, that's it. I'm Red, and I hope you have a good rest of your day or something.